Hi everyone, this is Dan Clanton, and this is our mini lecture on 1 Samuel chapters 1 to 15. Two preliminary notes before we get started. First, please remember that the material in 1 Samuel is taken from the larger collection of literature that biblical scholars refer to as the Deuteronomistic history. We've discussed this history in a previous mini lecture, so you should be familiar with not only the contents of that history, but also the overarching theological interests found therein. And secondly, all of the illustrations in what follows are taken from the Brick Testament, which can be found online at the website of the same name. Let's start out, appropriately enough, at the beginning with the birth narrative of Samuel. As we saw with the book of Genesis, it's not uncommon for the biblical narrator to tell stories about barren women. What that usually indicates to the reader is that a remarkable reversal of fortune is about to take place. That is, God will cause the barren woman to be fruitful, to have children. Think back to the story of Sarah. The first thing we hear about her is that she's barren, but that sets up for the reader an expectation that she will be unable to participate and or contribute to the covenant that God cut with Abraham that promises offspring. However, as we know, Sarah's barrenness is overcome by the power of God, just as we see in the story of Hannah. After all, in the ancient Near East, if a woman was unable to produce children, and more specifically male children, she would be virtually useless within the patriarchal household economy. And this seems to be what lies at the heart of Hannah's sorrow. Now, in order to petition God more forcefully to allow her to have a child, Hannah makes a vow that should sound familiar to us in chapter 1, verse 11. She promises God that if she has a male child, then she'll consecrate him as a Nazirite, that is, one who is separate, one who's set apart for a special service. And the reason this should sound familiar is that this is the exact same vow made by Samson's mother in Judges chapter 13, verse 5. As we might imagine, God hears the petition of Hannah, as we hear in chapter 1:19, the Lord remembered her. And true to her word, after Samuel is born in chapter 1, verse 20, she takes him up to the place of sacrifice at Shiloh. She brings the child to Eli, the priest of God, and leaves her son Samuel with Eli, or as she says in chapter 1, verse 28, she lends him to the Lord. Let's move on and take a look at the remarkable piece of literature we have in chapter 2, verses 1 to 11, the Song of Hannah. By now, you probably recognize how rare it is to have extended dialogue from female characters. In 1 Samuel 2, though, we have an extended song or prayer by Hannah. The insight that the narrator offers us here into the interior character of Hannah, that is, her thoughts, her feelings, her desires, her emotions, is virtually unique up to this point in Old Testament literature. Now let's take a closer look at three important aspects of this prayer. First, let's talk about how Hannah's prayer characterizes God. This is a God who's omniscient, as we see in verse 3, who seems to be omnipotent, also as we see in verses 6 and following. But this is also a God who cares for the poor and the needy, as we see in verses 7 to 8, and one who rewards faithfulness and punishes his enemies, as we see in verses 9 to 11. Central to understanding the theology expressed in Hannah's prayer is the theme of reversal we find therein. What I mean by this is seen in verses 4 and following. In those verses, we find again and again the idea that God can radically reverse the fortunes of anyone, and does so particularly with the oppressed and the persecuted. For example, those who are hungry are now fat in verse 5. The barren one has borne 7 children, also in verse 5. In verse 8, God raises the poor from the dust, lifts the needy from the ash heap, and makes them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. This theme of reversal is so important to understanding the theology of the prayer because it's an echo of what Hannah herself has experienced. That is, what Hannah is doing is expressing her own personal experience with God and using that to shape a larger understanding of the character of the deity. In this sense, what Hannah's doing in 1 Samuel 2 is quite similar to what we've already seen in the case of Hagar. That is, female biblical characters experiencing theophanies that reverse their fortunes for the better and then are allowed by the biblical narrator to name and express those divine experiences in biblical literature. And again, we should remember the virtual uniqueness of hearing a female statement of theology in ancient Near Eastern literature. Finally, one of the most interesting aspects of the Song of Hannah is the influence it has on New Testament literature, particularly on what's usually called the Magnificat, Mary's song of praise in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, verses 46 to 55. In the Gospel of Luke, a pregnant Mary has just encountered her cousin Elizabeth, who's pregnant with John the Baptist. And after Elizabeth exclaims loudly, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb," which should sound familiar to you Catholics, Mary launches into a song of praise and adoration for God, in which she also voices her own experience of a divine encounter, and in verses 51 to 53, echoes the theme of reversal that we saw in the Song of Hannah. As such, if you truly want to understand the way in which Luke tells his story of Jesus, you must be familiar with the Old Testament scriptures he alludes to and quotes from. The biblical narrator prefaces the call of Samuel by describing in 1 Samuel 2, verses 12 to 16, the evil sons of Eli. The purpose of doing so seems quite clear. The sons of Eli provide what we call a discordant example of behavior. That is, they show the reader the negative pole of how one who's been consecrated to God should act. As such, we have a kind of measuring stick over and against which to gauge the behavior of Samuel. And as you might imagine, Samuel comes off looking pretty well. After all, the book is called 1 Samuel. In previous mini-lectures, we've discussed the standard literary formulation of the call or commission narrative. Think back to Exodus 3 and the commission of Moses. We find a similar literary genre in 1 Samuel 3. Here, though, the narrator introduces two new wrinkles. First, Samuel is called not once, but 3 times, and every time he's called, he responds, "Here I am." Thus, second wrinkle, signaling his willingness to accept the call or commission of God. That is, he never says, "Oh no, I'm not able to do that," like many others who are called or commissioned do. After the third call, God provides a message or a prediction to Samuel in verses 10 to 14. It's concerned exclusively with the fate of the house of Eli and seems to indicate to the reader that at some point soon, Samuel will replace his master as the one chosen to serve as a divine intermediary between God and the people. Now, biblical narrative is notoriously terse and ambiguous. That is, it always seems far too brief, and it never tells us everything we'd like to know. For example, when Samuel delivers his message to Eli in chapter 3, verse 18, we can only imagine the horror and the regret that Eli must be experiencing, but all the biblical narrative tells us is Eli's response, which seems both dismissive and fatalistic. Now, the results of Samuel's call and his subsequent deliverance of God's message can be seen in chapter 3, verse 24. Samuel is referred to there as, quote, "a trustworthy prophet of the Lord," end quote, whose reputation is known far and wide. Now, this is obviously significant for us in our attempt to understand the development of Israelite religion. What does it mean, in other words, that Samuel is referred to as a prophet of the Lord? Does that imply a specific office with specific duties and specific responsibilities? As we'll see, Samuel embodies a number of roles within his religious vocation, and this indicates to us that Samuel is a transitional figure in the development of Israelite religion. And we'll return to this point in just a little bit. Beginning in chapter 4, the Philistines start to make war with Israel. Israel's defeated early on in verse 2, and then they decide to bring the Ark of the Covenant into battle in verse 4. But again, they're defeated in verse 10, and the Ark is captured by the Philistines in verse 11. Now, after the capture of the Ark, the biblical narrator includes a little aside to tell us about the fulfillment of Samuel's prophecy back in chapter 3, verse 18. We're told in chapter 4, verse 11, that the two evil sons of Eli died, and then in chapter 4, verse 18, Eli himself meets a rather ignominious ending. Chapter 5 echoes the divine combat theme that we discussed in our mini-lecture on the plagues. In this chapter, the Philistines have brought the ark to their city of Ashdod and have placed it in a temple dedicated to one of their gods, Dagon. Over the course of chapter 5, we hear a rather humorous story about the negative repercussions the presence of the ark has not only in the temple of Dagon, but also in the Philistine cities of Gath and Ekron, where they send the ark after it causes so much trouble in Ashdod. The Philistines finally decide that the ark's more trouble than it's worth, and in chapter 6 they decide to return it to the Israelites. Note, though, that they don't simply return it with gifts, an attempt to pacify or placate God so they don't run into any more trouble. In a transitional statement between the story of the return of the ark and a story about the return of Samuel, the author tells us that for 20 years the ark was stored at Kiriath Jearim, and, quote, all the house of Israel lamented after the Lord, end quote. After those 20 years, Samuel returns to the fore of the biblical narrative in chapter 7, verse 3, and exhorts all Israel to put away foreign gods and worship the Lord alone. Now, thus far in biblical literature, we haven't seen a strictly defined monotheistic religious system. That is, we haven't encountered a religious system in which there was one and only one God in existence, one in which all other deities were understood to be false gods. Instead, what we've seen is what religious scholars refer to as henotheism, or monolatry. That is, a religious system in which there are multiple deities, but only one of those is singled out for worship. Samuel here seems to be calling for a more strict monotheism than we've seen before, and in chapter 7, verse 4, Israel seems to comply. As we'll see, though, this situation doesn't last for too long. After all of Israel agrees to put away the foreign gods, we're told that Samuel establishes a headquarters of sorts at Mizpah, and the narrator tells us that Samuel, quote, judged the people of Israel, end quote. Here we see yet another role assigned to Samuel. We've already seen him referred to as a prophet in 3:20, and now it seems that Samuel is a judge as well. As I mentioned a minute ago, the multiplicity of roles which Samuel embodies indicates both that these roles haven't become concretized in the development of Israelite religion, as well as the fact that Samuel seems to be a transitional figure. Now, as if to indicate Samuel's newfound power and influence as a judge, the author in verses 7 to 11 tells us about his role in repelling the Philistine attack. In verse 9, Samuel intercedes for Israel in an intermediary, almost priestly capacity by offering a sacrifice to God in the hopes that God would intervene on Israel's behalf. His sacrifice is effective, as we hear in verse 9, quote, Samuel cried out to the Lord for Israel, and the Lord answered him, end quote. Could it now be that Samuel is prophet, judge, and priest all at the same time? 1 Samuel 8 is an extremely significant chapter for us in our ongoing attempt to understand the evolution of religion in ancient Israel through the witness of biblical literature. The people approach Samuel and request that he appoint them a king, quote, like other nations, end quote, in verse 5, after his sons do a particularly poor job judging Israel. The significance of this request lies not only in the way in which the people have constituted their relationship with the Lord, but the very identity which the Lord has wanted to create for the people. What I mean by this is that in biblical literature up to this point, the way in which God has exhorted the people to understand their identity because of the covenant was to develop an identity based on alterity. That is, God had asked the covenant community to define themselves over and against other peoples. In essence, this process of alterity defines group identity by a simple formula. We are who we are because we're not like them. In 1 Samuel 8, the people decide to abandon this process of identity formation and their traditional hierarchical relationship with God, and instead opt for acculturation. Put differently, instead of defining themselves over and against other peoples, the Israelites ask Samuel to make them just like everyone else. For the Deuteronomistic historian, this is an outrage, and one that will eventually lead to the downfall of Israel and Judah. God's response to Samuel's report of the people's request bears out this interpretation, as God tells Samuel in chapter 8, verse 7, quote, "They have rejected me from being king over them," end quote. God then instructs Samuel to appoint a king for the people anyway. Samuel returns to the people after speaking with God and delivers a long warning about the dangers of monarchy. Interestingly, many of the abuses that he catalogs in verses 10 to 18 sound suspiciously like what we'll see when we read about the activity of Solomon, the son of David, later on. It's worth asking, is the Deuteronomistic historian here inserting a sly wink to the reader concerning what he, living in the 6th century, has already seen as a result of the reign of Solomon? Now, as you know, the people refused to listen to Samuel and repeated their demand that he appoint them a king, quote, so that we also may be like other nations, end quote, in chapter 8, verse 20. Samuel again returns to the Lord, and the Lord again orders that Samuel appoint a king for Israel. Beginning in chapter 9, we hear the story of the choosing of the first king of Israel, a Benjaminite named Saul. Early on in this story, Samuel is again referred to as a prophet, leading us, again, to ask the question, what is it that Samuel actually does? Is he a judge? Is he a priest? Is he a prophet? Is he all three at the same time? What the heck's going on there? After Saul finds Samuel, and Samuel is told that Saul will be the first king, Samuel anoints Saul in chapter 10, verse 1. The significance of this anointing shouldn't be overlooked. From this point on, the king will be understood as the Lord's anointed. The Hebrew term for anointed here is Mashiach, or Messiah, what in Greek will be translated as Christos, or Christ. Now, it might sound confusing to hear that God gives Saul another heart in verse 9, but this will be an important and repeated phrase in the story of Saul. We hear it again in chapter 16, verse 14, and in chapter 19, verse 9. It'll be important to recall this new heart given to Saul when we're forced to ask the question later on, why is Saul acting in such a strange way? Similarly, after encountering Samuel, we're told that Saul encounters a band of prophets, is possessed by the Spirit of God, and falls into what the biblical author refers to as a prophetic frenzy. This activity of frenzy might also help explain Saul's increasingly erratic behavior later in the narrative. The story of how Saul is actually chosen to be king is not a particularly impressive one. Not everyone, including Saul himself, is sure about the choice of Saul as king, especially given that in chapter 10, verse 22, Saul hides himself among the baggage during the selection process. However, any doubts that anyone had about Saul's ability to fight battles on behalf of his people, which after all was an important component of the request of the people in chapter 8 for a king, are shown to be misplaced in chapter 11. In this chapter, Saul effectively defeats the Ammonites and is publicly made king in Gilgal as a result of his military victory in verse 15. Now on this slide I've provided a map of Saul's kingdom for you so that you can get a sense of the geographical importance of all the cities we've been talking about and other locations listed in 1 Samuel 1 to 15. And be advised, from this point on, geography will be your friend. So feel free to pause this video and take a look at this map. You have to have an understanding of the geography or you won't understand what's going on in the narrative. We've mentioned several times the numerous roles that Samuel has embodied in the narrative. At various times, he's served as prophet, judge, and/or priest. Once Saul is crowned king, though, Samuel probably rightly wonders, what role do I have to play now? As such, it's not surprising that immediately following Saul being crowned as king, the biblical author relates to the reader the farewell address of Samuel. One of the most obvious aspects of this farewell address is the influence of the Deuteronomistic historian, especially in verses 6 to 15. Not only is the structure in the historical reminiscences in this section similar to the structure of the stories in the book of Judges, but in verses 14 to 15 specifically, we hear the overarching theological position of the Deuteronomistic historian. Biblical scholars usually refer to this theological position as, quote-unquote, two ways theology. That is, if you follow the statutes and ordinances of the Lord, then you will prosper. If you don't, you will suffer. In other words, there are two ways set before you: the way of obedience, which will lead to blessings, and the way of disobedience, which will lead to curses. As we'll see in future books of the Deuteronomistic history, this two ways theology emerges as the central theological theme of the work, the foundational explanation of why Israel and Judah and the temple are all destroyed. Implicit in this Deuteronomistic critique is a healthy mistrust of the monarchy. This is seen clearly in verse 17, in which Samuel refers to the people's demand in chapter 8 for a king as, quote, wickedness, end quote. Nevertheless, Samuel assures the people in verse 22 that, quote, the Lord will not cast away his people for his great name's sake, because it has pleased the Lord to make you a people for himself, end quote. Put differently, even if the people choose the wrong path and disobey the statutes and ordinances of God and wind up being cursed, God will not abandon them. There is always the possibility of atonement and redemption. In chapter 13, Saul prepares to fight the Philistines. In this chapter, we hear the first account of Samuel's rejection of Saul. On this slide, I've listed 7 questions, and I'd like you to take a minute and try and answer these questions based on a close reading of the biblical text. I won't try to answer them in this mini lecture. Rather, I've listed them here in order to facilitate a greater engagement on your part with the biblical text. Here are the questions. Where is Samuel at the outset of chapter 13? What does 1 Samuel 10 verse 8 have to do with this chapter? What exactly does Saul do wrong in this chapter? What was the commandment Saul broke in 13:14? Is this picture of Saul different than the picture in 1 Samuel chapter 14 verse 35? Why do you think there's no reaction from Saul after chapter 13, verse 14? Do you think the Lord and Samuel may have ulterior motives here? What might those ulterior motives be? So feel free to take a minute, pause the video, reread the biblical text, and see what you can come up with from these questions. In chapter 15, we hear a second story about Samuel's rejection of Saul. Over the next 3 slides, I've listed 9 questions about this story. As with chapter 13, I've included these questions so that you can engage the biblical narrative in a deeper fashion than you might have before. So here are my questions. Who are the Amalekites? What does Samuel mean when he asks Saul to, quote, utterly destroy, end quote, the Amalekites? Which tribe does Saul spare in chapter 15, verse 6? Why would he do this? What does Saul and the people do in 15:9? And how does the Lord respond to this action? Why does the Lord respond this way? How does Samuel rebuke Saul in 15:14? And what's Saul's reaction? Similarly, what does Samuel ask Saul in 15:19? And how does Saul respond in 15:21? Samuel delivers a prophetic pronouncement in 15 verses 22 to 23. What does he say here regarding Saul's kingship, and how does he critique Saul? What does Saul do in response in 15:27, and how does Samuel respond in verse 28? What action does Samuel perform in 15:32 to 33? How does the narrator end this chapter, and why is this an appropriate ending? So take a minute, pause the video, reread the biblical text, and attempt to answer the questions that I've given you over 1 Samuel chapter 15. In conclusion, I want to talk about 4 issues. First, one of the most contested issues in the first 15 chapters of 1 Samuel is the nature of kingship itself. We've seen in chapter 8 that the request by the people for Samuel to appoint a king for them represents an adoption of the strategy of acculturation and an abandonment of the traditional process of identity formation through alterity. Put differently, the people's request for a king signifies a shift in how they understand themselves in relationship with other peoples on a horizontal axis and with God on a vertical axis. Samuel calls this request, this desire to change the nature of their identity, wicked, and God seems to agree with that assessment. Nevertheless, God instructs Samuel to appoint a king for the people, and in time, Saul is anointed as that king. However, in chapters 13 and 15, we've seen that Samuel is unwilling to go gently into that good night and emerges at critical moments to tell Saul that he's unworthy to be king and to prophesy that God will find another king. As we'll see shortly, that king will be David. In sum, the first 15 chapters of 1 Samuel seem to have a negative view overall on the issue of kingship. Second, as you've probably guessed by now, one of the main sources of conflict in these chapters is a sense of competition among God, Samuel, and Saul. Put differently, both Samuel and God are understandably upset that their traditional roles are being usurped by the people's request for a king who we find out will be Saul. Might this lie behind Samuel's rejection of Saul in chapters 13 and 15? Might this lie behind God's choosing of Saul as a king in the first place? As I mentioned earlier, the biblical text never tells us everything we want to know, but it's certainly a possibility. Third, at this point in Israelite history, we can say that this is a transitional period between the time of the judges and the time of the united monarchy. The multiple roles which Samuel occupies bear witness to the amorphous character of the religious cult during this period. That is, in a more structured religious setting, Samuel would have been unable to be priest, prophet, and judge all at the same time. As we'll see, the role of judge is slowly fading away, but the role of priest and prophet will soon become specific, concretized, and exclusive. Finally, as we discussed before, the people's request for a king in chapter 8 fundamentally shifts the hierarchical and theological identity of the people in that they no longer wish to have God as their king, and they no longer wish to define themselves over and against other peoples. In contrast to the period of the wandering in the wilderness, in which God was immanent and ruled immediately over the people now wish to have a more obvious human king to rule and fight for them. This alteration in the vertical axis of their identity is mirrored in the alteration of the horizontal aspect of their identity. That is, the people have always defined themselves over and against others, so that they were Israelites because they weren't Canaanites, Ammonites, Moabites, etc. They were members of the covenant community, and that membership entailed a high degree of difference and separation from other peoples. Now, however, instead of resisting their neighboring cultures, the people want to acculturate to them by acting like them by requesting a king. As we'll see, in the eyes of the Deuteronomistic historian, this is the first step in a long series of disobedience on the part of the people that will eventually lead to the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel, then the southern kingdom of Judah.